Hey everybody, it's the Scholar General Mo Jianbing. So I'm here with a special guest today. This is Dlatrex Swords, or Andy for short, and we have something super special to share with you guys. And we have been working on this project for a long time, mostly because I don't have time, and Andy's been waiting on me to get things done. But we have amassed a pretty big amount of sword data from antiques. And today we are finally ready to share some of this with everybody and learn some interesting things. So let's take it
It's
away.
really exciting. Yeah, this has been going on behind the scenes for quite a while. And this has been a pet project I've been really interested in. And to find a scholar in the Scholar General who has shared my crazy obsession with being able to collect data on original swords was like a godsend. So this has been very hush hush. This has been very secret behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But the idea is we have wonderful online public access to antiques. So obviously, we each own privately. We each own antique swords, which we have access to, and we can measure and collect the data on. But those are very individual points. Those are anecdotes, and we know other collectors. We have friends who similarly have antique swords, either Dao or Jian or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But publicly, anyone can go on websites to listings for museums. We have wonderful collections in things like the Mandarin Mansion, run by Peter Decker, who have sometimes very rigorous listings that are meticulously collected about the statistics and the metrics of these antique swords. And the goal for all of us as both collectors, practitioners, folks who are interested in really getting an idea what the handling characteristics are like, what the points of balance, what the length, what the original swords were from the Ming and Qing periods. If we're looking specifically right now at Chinese swords, the best way to do that is through empirical evidence. So I have a background in statistics, and so I make spreadsheets for fun. And so it's always been a kind of dream of mine that we could put together this big database where we could just scroll through these online listings and start assembling all the data that's out there in a way that you could search through and manipulate and run analytical statistics on the swords that are available. And I think that you even brought the subject up to me, and this I don't remember which of us came up with it first, but it went off like fire. It was like
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
like lighting a match in a warehouse of gasoline.
Yeah.
And so very quickly we've been combing through pretty much anything that has well, that's a good place. So what in your mind was the way that we'd set this up? How did we decide what swords would make the cut? Because there are lots of beautiful swords that you can find pictures of, but not every listing necessarily will qualify as something that can make it into our sword database.
Yeah, so from my perspective, first I just got to say that I'm super happy to have Andy helping me with this, because my ability to manage data is, you can ask him, it's like next to zero. so I mostly read books, and practice martial arts. That's mostly what I do. But I see the value in
You're very good
data.
at that.
I see the value in data, and this whole idea for this project started with me when I was like talking with people about some of the reproductions on the market, and then they're like, well, it's like this and this. I was like, but I don't think that's necessarily representative. And then and whenever I make any kind of claim, I have to back it up, right? I'm not gonna, because I don't want to say something and be like, I say this because I think it. I'm gonna say it because it's what the evidence shows, right? So that way you don't lose arguments. But but what I did was I very hastily ran through Mandarin Mansion and pulled some stats on a few swords, and I was like, look, it's not quite like that. And whenever I did that, I realized this works, but I need to do this in a much more robust way and have a lot more data as much as possible. And then we get to this question of making this database and how do we decide what goes in it or not. Our starting point is Decker's website, Mandarin Mansion, because it is so amazing. It's like, for people who do Chinese sword stuff, it is like the holy grail of websites. And
if I could just pause for a moment just to have a quick shout out to Peter Decker, because he is nothing if a consummate gentleman. Any time that I have had a question or need access to something that perhaps is not readily available, he has always been more than forthcoming and more than willing to spend time personally, like one-on-one with me, to try and help me in any way that he can. So not only is he just like in a kind of public capacity doing a tremendous service to the antique community and the research that he's providing by way of his website and the Mandarin Mansion, but just even personally in the time that he's made, any time that I need assistance in the research I'm doing, he's been fantastic.
Yeah, and I just second that. He's always been a huge help and resource personally and publicly. And so branching out from his work and his website, where else do we look? And my kind of guiding principle was, number one, you try to find a reputable dealer. And I wasn't just going on eBay and just pulling off these supposedly antique swords, So you try to find a reputable dealer, and then you look at the blade, you say, is it likely to be real or fake, and try to be conservative in what you label as authentic. And on top of that, museum listings are also key. Now, I didn't always get everything I wanted, because sometimes you find a museum and they give you like one measurement. And whenever I was primarily in charge of amassing the Dao in this database, and Andy did the Jian, and he's also done a few other things, which we won't talk about right now. But whenever I was going through these Dao, and if it only had like one measurement, I wouldn't usually put it in. I usually try to have at least two measurements for every entry. And this also included, and I also try to meticulously record like some specific details about swords and the inscriptions and all this other stuff. But so.
And it's worth noting that one of the pieces of data that we include in this database is the citation. So wherever we're pulling the listing from is included, so that we can go back. And that's something I think is important, because many times, over the however many years I've been studying swords, there are some listings that I'm very familiar with, referenced multiple times. And as I've gone back, the curators have updated the listings and added more information about the sword. And by making sure you have robust citations of all of this, we will have the ability to perhaps enhance the database in the future. So hopefully you guys at the museums keep on improving, keep on going back and measuring, add more stuff, and it'll only help us going forward. So approximately how many Dao have you included in the database at this point?
Oh, goodness. I want to say like over 160. Now, I have to say, I was just throwing all kinds of Dao in there. And
And Dao is a bit of an inclusive term.
Yes, and Dao is a very inclusive term. So, but mostly, I have around 55 or so Peidao. So a single-handed, basically what I would say is like a saber, right? So I have about a little over 50 of those, which it's not as much as you want, of course. With data, more is always better, right?
Sure.
But but it's a workable number. It's not looking at 5 and then making extrapolations. And the value of the database is that it allows us to get a little bit of a picture of some potential general tendencies that existed across the weapons, as opposed to one weapon, which is an anecdote, right? So,
Absolutely.
but that being said,
So, yeah.
as valuable as the data is, there's a lot of caveats to how it can be used, and this is where Andy's expertise really comes in and helps me out.
Yeah, so I'll just mention for anyone. So the thrust of this discussion today, hopefully the title of the video will mention that we're hoping to talk a little bit empirically about what the data says about Peidao, so waist sabers from the Ming and Qing period, or Ming, Qing, and beyond. I'm a little bit behind him in collecting Jian, so right now the straight swords are trailing. And that says a little bit about, the use of the swords in period and how they are preserved. So even that is something from a kind of survivorship standpoint. So that's something interesting to consider right there. But before we jump into this, so we're going to talk about what the data says on what we have collected, but there are caveats to concern. So we've already discussed that these are publicly held records. Yes, both Keith and I have our own swords that we've measured and have entered into the database. But for the most part, we are not having physical hands on any of these swords. So we're going to be limited in that we're relying on other folks to have taken these measurements, uploaded them, and have done so faithfully. And the more folks you have doing that, the larger amount of error you will introduce, because you will have different standards and practices. You will not have a unified way of doing things. Different institutions and different research teams will have different understanding of where do you start for measuring your blade length, for instance. Do you start at the beginning of the discard? Do you start at the beginning of the handle? What have you? Then you even have errors when it comes to putting the data on to the website. There's many times where we've looked at the numbers and like, that number does not look right.
Just a typo. The typos happen.
There's a typo in there. Someone put it in imperial instead of metric. And in many cases, you have no way of knowing. If it's on the Mandarin Mansion, we can reach out perhaps to Peter Decker and get an answer if he feels it was correct or an error. But in many cases, we have no recourse on figuring out if there's any alternative. We, in order to better analyze this data, we have put labels on many of the different swords. However, unlike, for instance, in the Nihonto community, where there is a very rigorous vocabulary that has developed kind of in the post-Edo period, there does not exist something, a kind of taxonomical definition in the Chinese collection world. There is beginning to be one. Again, going back to Peter Decker, he has developed a typology for many of the Dao in the Ming and Qing period, but it has not gained complete mainstream acceptance, nor does it cover all types of swords. So terminology is not standardized across the board. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Keith, of how you've had to make judgment calls?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing with Chinese swords and most non-Nihonto in the world, but the categorization is always difficult, and the antiques themselves, have a lot of variability. And it's not like we are getting into like later military sabers where they have a pattern and they're modeling off the same sword all the time and stuff. No, none of these are like that. So it's it's just complicated. And then it also gets into these linguistic arguments of like what term represents what thing, and is it period accurate or not. Most of the terms are not period. And the ones that are, you don't necessarily know if it referred to the same thing in period as it does now. So there's all these linguistic debates to be had. But in general, what I've tried to do is we have the overall category of Peidao, which is period accurate. It makes sense. And it's fairly consistent. Refers to single-handed, curved, single-edged swords, and that you wear on your waist. Pei, right? Or they accompany you, right? Peidao. But within that broad category, there's a whole lot of variability, and a couple of the blades have in here are even of non-Chinese origin, of course, and that also makes things really interesting. Like, what do you call a Chinese Dao when it has a very pronounced yeoman? And it's like a Kilich blade almost, right? So it's like a whole can of worms that the community of researchers who work on this stuff haven't really been able to reach any kind of consensus on. So,
yeah. And the only last thing I'd say is, rather than running very rigorous analysis, running chi-square or students t-test or anything like that, our sample size isn't really big enough for that. Separately, behind the scenes, we've been talking about looking at databases for other swords, which contain hundreds, if not thousands of swords. We're looking at a very modest data set of only, 50-something swords for this particular family. And as a result, that's not strong enough to bring the full weight of statistical analysis to bear. So this is really just a kind of preliminary look at kind of general trends. So don't take anything we say here to heart and just run and extrapolate and assume that this refers to everything that happens. We have a big problem with there not being nearly enough swords from the period that have survived and are in good condition and have been recorded.
Certainly, yes. And and the thing is that this is just what we were able to publicly access as well. And there's a lot of swords out there that we don't have access to, right? And we're gonna. That being said, though, because we've started this project, I don't plan on finishing it, really. I mean, I'm just gonna keep it going, and we're just gonna keep adding data and expanding, then strengthening the data set, right? And
if you know a sword, contact us.
Yes. If you want to have if you own a sword and you want to add it to the database, please reach out. We'll gladly expand our data set because that's what it's all about. So,
would you like to look at some pretty charts, Mr. Keith?
Yes. Let's get into the fun stuff. So we're actually going to look at our data and what it might say. So.
Yeah, so rather than look at the data and the raw, I've created a couple charts that we can use as talking points. So here, let me try and share. Hopefully I pull up the right screen, otherwise it's just going to be me looking at me. Okay, hypothetically, this is sharing my PowerPoint.
Yes, it is. Yep. So go
okay.
ahead and...
and again, interrupt me at any point because I love to hear the sound of my own voice. So this is just a kind of table 1 where it's describing the different subtypes of the Peidao. As described, you said you had 50-something total Peidao recorded. And as you have labeled them, these are the different subtypes. Now, right here at the bottom, we've split them into 2 different types. So we have sabers and we have Zibadao, or straight-backed, kind of like back swords or palash style. So real fast, one is just listed as a plain Zibadao, and one is listed as a Niue Dao, or oxtail. Now, we do have another category of oxtail under the sabers, which I think would be a much more common. So where's my visual aid? Here's just to show, I'm actual Chinese sword guy. Here's my oxtail saber for visual reference. I don't know if it's on camera or not.
Yeah, it is.
We have 7 oxtail Dao listed. And you can see that as described, the majority of them are actually willow leaf saber, or Lu Ya Dao. Which isn't that surprising. The transition between the older Ming-style Yanling Dao, or Yanamao Dao, into the more, I guess, Qing-favored Lu Ya Dao seems to be reflected in what we've described here. And again, you have some other kind of interesting ones. You have a couple Japanese style, whether those are actual Japanese or just Chinese-made imitation, I'm not sure. You have a single Euro-style blade. You have Was Yanqidao translated into Phoenix Wing?
No. It's the same as goose, right? Goose wing saber, and then Yenling Dao is the goose quill saber, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though Yenmao Dao also refers to goose quill in a different way, but then
yeah. Yunto Dao, so the fish head, and then the Central Asian style. So these ones, I assume, have the raised yeoman in the back, perhaps. Yes.
Yeah, one of them does. One of them is a little bit different, but we won't worry too much about that right now.
So, to me, it looks like the majority are these two, either the goose quill or the willow leaf, which isn't surprising since, just kind of anecdotally, they seem to be the most favored military general styles. They have just a kind of pointy tip, and that either a mostly straight with a curve at the end or curve all along their length. And then next up is the oxtail, which is traditionally not considered a military pattern of Peidao.
Yeah. Which one comment I have here is just how much more Liu Ye Dao and Yanling Dao there are than Niu Wei Dao, and this just really goes to show that even though every single kung fu school in the world pretty much will use a Niu Wei Dao in their form, in the past in China, the Niu Wei Dao is not the most common. And
now, I would be very slightly cautious about this, because we are again going off of public listing.
Yes.
Now, I know, for instance, if you go to a place like the Royal Armories, you might find, let's say, a Napoleonic saber. So let's say they have room for 5 swords. It's much more likely that they are going to put a saber from the period of Napoleon that is gold hilted with an ivory grip and with blue and yellow gilt on the blade out, that was carried by a famous lieutenant, than a trooper's saber that is half rotted away and not there, even if they have 100 swords.
Yes, that is very true.
Depending on how rigorous the listing and depending on the condition that the blades were in, we may see, it's not exactly survivorship bias, but kind of representation bias, kind of like what they want to have public facing.
Mm-hmm.
And from like photographs of the period, we see Niu Wei Dao being very well represented in the late Qing. We have Ben Judkes's captures of like in the Shanghai police, where they're capturing all of these like really grody sort of blades that don't even have grips on them and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You do see Niu Wei Dao represented, but the question is, did they ever make it into these museum collections? So it's something to consider.
Yeah. That's certainly true, and I do think that, I mean, part of this is probably my bias slightly against Niu Wei Dao. I will really admit that, but I do think that the martial arts world as it stands currently could do to pay more attention to the alternatives to the Niu Wei Dao, instead of it being like the singular monolith. Because in the past, especially with anyone connected to the military, the other Dao were the standard. So
absolutely, yeah. If the question is, were the other types of saber popular at one point, I think it definitely bears that out.
Yeah.
You ready to move on to the next slide?
Yep.
Okay, so on this slide, we're actually starting to look at the difference in this case of this is a distribution looking at the blade length of how each of the different types of swords have their distribution. So you can see that we're getting some clustering in this case for the blade length. I have the group split up here in increments of 2 centimeters. So the whole
or
group
3 centimeters,
ranges from.
right? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, 3 centimeters. You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I don't even remember what groups I was doing. So we're starting at a low of about 58, all the way up to 91. So you have some decent size sabers that you're working with here. But the hot spot in this case is really between about 67 centimeters and 73 centimeters. So kind of medium-sized sabers that we're working with. And unsurprisingly, the Lu Yedao are the ones that kind of cluster in that range. So this is where you can start to see different sword styles start to break out in different ranges. So the Japanese style sabers tend to be a little bit longer. The Yanling Dao actually are very slightly more likely to be on the shorter side.
Yeah, slightly shorter.
And the oxtail sabers tend to be a little bit on the longer side, including one that is quite large in this case.
Yeah. A little bit of an outlier, but
yeah.
But the I think what's interesting here is in general, the category that seems to be by far the biggest would be 67 to 73 centimeters, and but interestingly, there's no Peidao in that grouping, right? Now, it could just be us not having enough volume of data, but I do think it's telling that the large concentration of Liu Yedao and as well as a few Yanling Dao within that group, that really seems to be kind of the average blade length. Somewhere around 70 centimeters is probably the sweet spot for those.
In fact, I can probably make us a histogram for that if you humor me for 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
So
you work in the black magic. So
how do I? Oh no. I'd have to eliminate. Can't do it this way. It's going to be too noisy because it's going to have all of the different.
Yeah, it'd have like a million different blades for every blade length. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking I could pull off just the other ones. All right. I'll revisit this at a later point where I can.
Yeah. We don't have to do it right now, but let's go to that next one.
So the other. Yeah, go ahead.
Unless you had something else to say about the blade length. Okay, we'll keep going.
So the other graph on here is exhausting. So as we go up in blade length, the hilt length generally does go up, but the relationship is not very strong. It's not a particularly linear relationship. So usually longer blades will have longer hilts on them, but you cannot predict the predictive power of the model, at least as a simple linear equation, is not very good. It's very weak. There's almost no strict relationship between them. So, it looks like it gets a little bit stronger the shorter you go, so it would be interesting if we continue it out here. But, there comes a point that you can't make the hilt any smaller.
Exactly,
because you still
that's
have
what I was just going to say, yeah. I mean, it looks like 15 centimeters is about the smallest hand size that we're seeing. Nobody's getting their hand on something smaller than that. So that's kind of a lower cap.
At that point, it's going to just flatten out, and it's just going to stay all one size. Now, it gets kind of wild the bigger you get, and that makes sense, because, big blades, especially in China, I think that compared to some other places, Europe, Japan, India, what have you, there's this predilection to having really long grips on sabers. So
Yeah.
we might see some really wild hilts
And
when we start looking at the really
yes,
big swords.
it's also this thing where in quite a few Chinese martial arts styles, they're like transitioning between one-handed and two-handed use of the sword quite frequently, and yeah, so having a slightly longer grip that can accommodate that would be something that perhaps some of the people using these in the past would have wanted.
Yeah. All right. Shall we go on to the next one?
Yep. Sure.
Okay. Oh, here's the meat of our discussion for today. So this is how the point of balance lay. Now, it's worth noting that many of the listings we had did not have point of balance
Yes.
recorded.
Yeah, the grand total is
almost
just over half. It's not.
Yeah. So I did include the missing count in the
Yeah.
listing here. So just be aware we're working with an even more limited data set than our already small kind of group. But here's how it breaks down with all of the different groups. You can see that we have, fewer oxtails to compare, about half of each of the others. None of the Central Asian swords had their point of balance measured. But generally speaking, the Yanling Daos actually have kind of further out point of balance than the willow leaf sabers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Kind of interesting, especially considering the opposite was kind of true when it came to blade length.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have a slightly shorter blade, then extending the point of balance out a little bit further allows you to still do some good cuts, right?
Right.
Yeah. But it looks like the concentration, the biggest, is 16 to 18 centimeters.
16 to 18 centimeters.
There's 10
is where the kind of sweet spot.
And 14 to 16
so
also
it's
has
gonna be yes. So it's 14 to 18 is going to be where most of our measurements are coming from. And again, we still have a range in absolute terms between 8 and 26.
Yes.
Because our data set is so limited, it's going to be hard for us to say, oh, everything is exclusively between 14 and 18, although we do have a pretty sizable cluster there.
Yeah.
But we're still exhibiting in absolute terms, considering that the rest of our data is so sparse, we still have a pretty large range as to where these point of balance fall.
Yeah, there's a pretty big range. And then it looks like the middle has a cluster there, but it's not enough to... We can't really comment too much about how rare or unique some of the things at the outside of that cluster are, because with more saber measurements, you could always say that some of these are more common than they appear in the data set. So
yeah. So and once again, running a linear model on it, you have a stronger relationship than the previous model we looked at with the hilt, but it's still reasonably weak, and it falls apart the further we go up. So
that's
the shorter ones, so the shorter blades have a more kind of consistent point of balance, and again, that may be due to the clustering that we're seeing in the kind of 65 to 70 centimeter blade length. And when you hit right about 70 centimeters, you have a lot of blades being represented. And then you end up with all sorts of different kind of points of balance that are experimented with. So this may be due to if we go back up to blade length.
Yes. We simply have more blades within that
we have
category.
More blades and more and kind of different
types within.
Yeah. So you have both the willow leaf and the goose quill being represented, and so that may be throwing off the model. So I might have to separate these out by different type and see if these up here are one type of blade and these down here are a different type of blade, and we might be looking at two different blade families, and that's pulling the model in two different directions, which is why there's such disunity.
Yeah.
Oh, that's something to try. I don't know that that's actually going to be the case,
Yeah,
but
it's hard to say. But in general, I think that the 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 general trend is that if you have a 短刀 or a shorter blade,
yeah,
you're gonna have a slightly closer point of balance than
yeah,
what we'd say a full length blade of like 70 centimeters
yeah,
or more. Um, but yeah, what's also interesting is that swords with the highest point of balance were also within that 70 centimeter category. Whereas when you have a much longer
yeah.
blade, the point of balance comes back down some. Uh,
So this is me thinking on the fly, but I suspect that this big line here is actually this group of Yanling Dao that's
mhm.
just
Yeah, that has a
because
much
the
higher point
Yanling
of
Dao
balance
actually
there.
have the point of balance are going up. So
Yep, yep.
I suspect that you just have a kind of wild group. And if we assume that these Yanling Dao were military sabers and perhaps
Hmm.
they were less likely to exceed a certain military regulation of length, they may instead have been allowed to have variability in how heavy they were.
Yeah.
That's just one theory on the fly
Well,
that could
there
exist.
is some of those Yenling Dao are like Southern Green Standard Army issue sabers that they're quite characteristic in that they have like a coin disc guard and
Right.
yeah, that so that could very well be that the length is slightly restricted, but they have more variability within their allowance of point of balance, right?
Yeah.
And yeah. But one other thing I want to say about this data set, because I think in general the common perception of many swords is that 15 centimeter point of balance is kind of crazy out there, like super heavy. What are you
Yeah.
doing swinging around this club?
Right.
But I really do not think, I really don't think we should be thinking of it this way, because some swords simply have a quite high point of balance, and Chinese swords are usually like this. So I don't think we, like, coming from Euro swords or some other swords of the world, people would say this is crazy. Why are you having such a heavy club? But the whole system is designed to do this. And I should also state that you can still have, if your blade length is down to like 70 centimeters and you have some good tapering in your blade, you can still have a very maneuverable, very nice feeling sword that has a point of balance that's like 18 centimeters.
Yep.
It's not like you have to, there's not one way to make a properly weighted sword, whatever that means, right? So you don't have to bring the point of balance down. You can still have it feel good and maneuverable while keeping it out there a little bit.
Right. So point of balance is one way to describe the mass distribution and handling characteristics of the sword, but it's not the only one. Unfortunately, it's one of the easiest ones to both measure and describe, which is why I think so many people focus on it.
Mm-hmm.
But you can get hyper focused on it, and
Yeah.
that will lead you astray if you're
Yeah.
only looking at that in describing how maneuverable a sword is.
Yeah, because we don't have to get into all the details, but you can have 3 swords with the same point of balance that feel completely different in the hand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so, and again, I just, for visual comparison, I put the 15 centimeter point of balance, I marked it as a line here, and you can see how many swords are below it and how many swords are above it.
And generally, once you get to 70 centimeters blade length, which is really not that long in most people's eyes, all the swords are above 15 centimeter point of balance. But that brings us kind of to the next thing we're going to talk about, which is how do our reproductions stack up against these antiques?
So in anticipation of doing this video, I just very quickly went and collected some of the posted data just from the manufacturer's listing that you can find on places like Cult of Athena for reproductions of Peidao. So these are modern oxtail sabers, modern Yanling Dao, modern Luye Dao, what have you. Anything that we would consider a modern version of a Ming or Qing period waist saber. And I collected the exact same sort of thing that we were interested in. So the total length, the blade length, the point of balance, the mass, just out of curiosity to see how they would compare. And I ran this same sort of thing. So just like this point of balance versus blade length, I ran a similar type of correlative scatter plot chart. This next chart will look messy, but let's see if we can sort it out. So the yellow represents the exact same distribution that we were looking at. So if we look
blade
here
length to
at
point
this
of balance,
blue dot,
yeah,
it's the yellow is the original antique data set that we looked at. But on top of that, I have also added 3 other data sets. So at the bottom, the gray is from the Art of Fire and Iron, a maker are they out of Taiwan? I don't remember exactly where they're at. The orange is sword maker LK Chen, and then the blue represents just several other assorted brands such as Hanwei and traditional Filipino weapons that may have only had like 1 or 2 swords, and I've just grouped them together.
Yeah.
So this is the same this is the same point of balance versus blade length as we were looking at on the previous chart. But now, just to make it even more confusing, I've put 3 other modern manufacturers there together. So what's going on here? Oh, the other makers have taken 2 different approaches in how they have decided to balance their swords. One is what I would call a cluster sample. So in the case of the Art of Fire and Iron, let's say that they've made 5 swords. They probably had access to several antiques. And they said, okay, a cluster of the balances around, these 70 centimeter blade length swords is around here. And so we're going to cluster our balance point around here, and that's what they've done. And so all of their balances are around this point, around
15 to 18.
Length. Yeah, 15 to 18 without a lot of variability. So no matter how long their blade is, their balance point will always be around there, because probably most of their samples that they're basing that on are going to be in this range. And so that's how they assume that all antiques probably operate in that range. The other way that you can do it is by trend, and this is kind of like comparing a short person to a tall person, and as the short person gets taller, they get heavier. But it depends on if you're looking at a skinny person or a fat person. If you're starting with a skinny person, as they get taller, they will get heavier, but they'll stay on the skinny side of the BMI. And if you start with a fat person, as they get taller, they'll be on the heavy side of the BMI.
Yeah.
That's what sword maker LK Chen has done. So LK Chen has figured out that as you go up the blade length, you need to go up the point of balance. And he has done that, but he is on the very fringes of what we have sampled so far from our limited antique data set. He is just barely within the range of what we found. So I have several LK Chen swords over here. So this is the Woya Dao. Yeah, and I'm measuring, let's see, I actually have my point of balance measured right there. And if I just measure it out real fast, it is measuring like 16 centimeters. So it's this one right here.
Yeah, and that one's that one appears to be a little closer than some of the others, but but for instance, the Yanling Dao that I just got, I'll measure it right now, and it is this one's so sharp it's trying to cut into me. So if I measure that, it's going to be only
8.5 centimeters or so. Let's see if I have that one on the chart. So yeah, that one's
right down
way
there.
down here.
That one that's very low.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have two extremes, even though they're not that dissimilar from blade length. One handles very nimbly in the hand, and the other one carries a lot of weight much closer to the end of the blade. So he obviously understands how the point of balance needs to travel, but LK Chen has an opinion that the blades probably needs to be slightly more lively in the hand and more like a fencing weapon than most historical swords were. There's another one that's here. I believe this is the Qiji Yaodao, and that one is probably closest to the historical
the Qiji,
ranges.
the Qiji Guang.
Yeah.
Qijiadao, this is pretty interesting. I think, based on what you're saying, it's kind of like LK Chen has found or kind of sees the correlation between blade length and point of balance, but then he's chosen to use the most lively, or the sword he's chosen out of the historical range, right? He's kind of seen the historical range, and he's like, I'm going to do the swords that feel really good to swing around in your backyard and cut water bottles and stuff.
And again, we'll caveat this again, just like we had said before, point of balance is only one measurement of several measurements for how a sword handles. So that's just because the point of balance is pulled back does not mean the rest of the sword does not handle properly. I've handled many LK Chen swords, and they usually do handle quite nicely. Yeah. But compared to other data points that we've collected, to me, these point of balances on the Peidao probably could all move up between 3 and 5 centimeters, and they'd probably be much more faithful to the antiques based on the data we've collected so far.
Yeah. If they just went through their line and added 3 centimeters to the point of balance of quite a few of their Dao, it would be much closer to the original data. Yes.
Yeah. So again, not quite a historical, but pushing it. So we're on the kind of like bottom 5% of the historical range from what I can see.
So how many? So what would that be like? Would that be more? That's more than one standard deviation, right? Because one standard deviation would be 25%.
This is probably like two standard deviations.
So about 2 standard deviations off. So that's a pretty tiny minority.
But again, I don't want to say that just because we don't actually have a big enough sample set to say that. But just eyeballing it, that's probably what I would say.
Yeah.
And just to round out, this is the same sort of idea, but this is looking at blade length versus the weight, since most of the manufacturers posted the weight of the swords.
Yes.
In this case, all of the makers are pretty much the same. The Art of Fire and Iron had one outlier that was really, really heavy.
It's pulling their line way off.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if I dropped that out, the line was still pretty much traveling in this direction.
Yeah.
Not that it matters, because the rest of them cluster pretty handsomely together. So I would say the makers are, for the most part, doing a good job. This one down here was a Hanwei sword that was a Wushu sword that I decided to include just for fun.
See what it does.
Yeah. So you can tell that the Wushu blades are significantly lighter than the combat blades.
Yeah.
And that's not to be expected, although you can see that it is still flirting with the original range. So on the whole, I'd say there is more variability among antiques than among modern manufacturers. Modern manufacturers have been pretty good about finding kind of the middle of the road for antiques as far as the weight of the swords. Some of them are getting a little on the heavy side. I'd have to go back and chase down to see exactly which ones they are.
Well, I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but the rest of them, Art of Fire and Iron, LK Chen, they seem to be pretty good. If anything, they're not light. If anything, they're very slightly on the heavy side. But not. I'd say that they're pretty much spot on. I'd say they're 50th, 60th percentile, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're basically right there, really, really close to the median or the the average. And
Yep.
the just a couple things that stand out to me would be, number one, not that many of the swords are above 1,000 grams. And I think that this is something that whenever people think of Dal, they think of a heavy, choppy sword. And I think that they're actually, and if you ask them, they would, well, okay, now I'm speculating, but I think that the general, some people's general mind, a Dal is going to be a very heavy sword. When in reality, it looks like the data seems to suggest that a Dal is actually not that heavy in terms of total mass, but it does have a pretty significant blade presence in the point of balance.
Yeah.
So yes, it's true.
And I get it, because like if you're looking at this, especially if this is the archetypal sword, everyone just assumes that's a lot of metal without looking at the fact that it's so incredibly thin in cross section.
Yeah.
So if you're used to much thicker, much more robust swords, you have to extrapolate that it's going to be a very heavy sword.
Yeah.
But
in reality,
you're right about the balance.
The total mass rarely goes above 1,000 grams. Now, they definitely exist. And there's also this big question of what do swords look like when they're meant to be worn by civilians, and what do swords look like whenever they're meant to go to war, right? And of course, if I'm taking something to a battle, you kind of have to dummy proof them. You gotta, well, not just dummy proof, but you also have to make it able to stand up to a lot more abuse just within combat. Whereas if you're just wearing it every day, you are incentivized to lighten it up to make it easier to carry around. So it could be that some of this is coming just because there's a survivorship bias with civilian weapons and Peidao that were worn by officers being more likely to survive than swords that were taken into battle. However, I do think that in the general that people should try to keep in their minds that Peidao can be quite light, and some of these are even approaching 500 grams, which is crazy. Now, admitted, quite a few of those are Duandao. And there's also this open question of how much does polishing and sharpening over time take away mass. Generally speaking, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to say for sure. But, so, you could put a plus or minus 50 grams on there quite easily, I think, as like a general caveat.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to change it dramatically, but I agree that we can adjust it slightly.
But yeah, in general, I think, shooting for 700 to 800, 700 to 900 grams seems like a fairly standard average for most Peidao.
Yeah.
So. And the reproductions are doing that, which is great.
Yeah. So obviously we were a little critical, and we were giving some of the manufacturers a hard time concerning point of balance. But I think it's kind of nice to go out on a note showing that in many ways they're actually being quite good and quite faithful when it comes to how they're doing on the absolute weight of the swords.
Yeah.
All right. So do we have any parting thoughts or parting concerns?
Here, just 1 second. Let me straighten this. Sure. Yeah, so, in general for me, I just wanted to share some of this so that people have this idea of, mostly just because I want people to think of Peidao in particular as being something that has a slightly lower total mass in the grand scheme of swords, slightly lower total mass, and fairly high point of balance whenever we're comparing it to many like European swords, because many people in HEMA are familiar with something like an arming sword or a military saber, and in general Peidao, they're going to be a little bit shorter, maybe like 70 centimeters or so. They're going to have a point of balance that's like maybe 14 to 18 centimeters from the guard, and then their total mass is going to be probably somewhere between 700 to 900 grams, just as a general takeaway. So, I don't know. Was there anything else you wanted to add? So.
No, I think that that's good. I'm excited to see the project go forward.
Oh,
So
yeah.
this is the first analysis, and I think that it already is providing data for the community. So thanks for inviting me to chat about it, and hopefully this is useful for folks out there that are curious about this. And we'll see if we can collect additional swords and be able to do more future analyses on perhaps other aspects of the swords as we go along.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's still quite a few other Dao in that database, and there's Jian and some other things too.
Yeah.
And in the future, we are definitely going to be doing more with this. The whole point of this is that it's a continuous resource. And I also want to say that we are going to release a public version of this database so that people can go in there on their own and poke around. Because, yeah, in general, I want I want researchers to be compensated for their efforts, but at the same time, I believe that all knowledge should be open for people to learn. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, that's it for now. Please leave comments down in the videos, ask questions, and if you have a sword and you want us to maybe put it in the database, go ahead and message one of us.